About a decade ago, I saw something that I couldn't explain. Something that, to me, was supposed to be just a bunch of Hollywood crap. But let me tell you, some of the things you see in scary movies, they're very real, my friend. I'd like to introduce myself to you, and also thank you for being someone that people like me can talk to about the stuff that we've seen. It's nice to have someone that doesn't automatically just blow you off as crazy or telling lies. My name is Zachary Belford. When this happened, I was in my early 40s. I do construction for a living. Back then, I was working for a gentleman named Steve. Now I'm proud to say I have my own business. I have 4 children. All of them are grown up and out of the house now, but back then, my littlest were 11 years old. Twins. I have been happily married to my second wife for almost 30 years now. Just don't ask about the first one. We live in Oregon, but this happened to me and my buddy Wes in Washington State, up by the border. We like to hunt, Wes and I, and we got all the things we needed that were necessary to legally hunt in Washington. We were supposed to be up there in the cabin for a week. A few years before that, we'd pooled our money together to buy it from some stranger that we found on the web. It had good pictures, and when we got there it was nice clean. We were going to stay there and just have a little vacation. Our plan was to go out and hunt while we could, but also to just go out and have a good time. We'd just finished a contract that ran for almost a year. A lot of steady work, but lots of long hours. We just had to keep on track for Steve. We finished and we were ready for a well-deserved break. Both our wives encouraged us to go out and have an adventure, so we started planning and came up with this trip. Man, we should have just taken our families to Disneyland. The first thing I thought when I saw this thing was werewolf. From what I gathered on the web and with you helping me, I now know that we got 2 different things that it could be. A werewolf and a dogman. It's crazy to me to think that there's more than one kind of thing like this out there. It makes me worry about what else people in the movie business base on real monsters. Based on the lessons that you gave me in Monsters Are Real 101, I would bet my money on the fact that we did run into an honest-to-God werewolf. This encounter happened the day we got there. We didn't even get a chance to go hunting. We got there early in the morning to get situated, and I planned on going out the next day to see what we could find. So we hung out for the day, just relaxing and bullshitting, talking about what a pain in the ass that construction job was and how glad we were that it was finally over. This cabin is pretty far off the beaten path. It's about an hour from the nearest town, and we decided that night we'd go into town and get stocked up on food for the time that we were going to be there. I guess we could have done it before we got there, but I think we were just eager to get there and unload. But then Wes decided that he wanted to go in town by himself, which I was fine with. I didn't feel like going anywhere anyway. I was just enjoying being out in the forest. So I gave him some cash and a list of things that we should get, and he told me that he'd be back later. He was gone for a few hours. Doing what? I don't know, and it doesn't even really make a difference to the story, but the important part of it is, I was alone when I first caught a glimpse of this thing. I was just standing out on the porch after dark and enjoying a nice breeze in the fresh air. I was listening to the noises that I could hear in the forest, and I was enjoying a nice smoke. There was this rocking chair out on the porch, and I sat down there to enjoy my cigarette, opened up a cold one, and all of a sudden the entire forest went completely mute. Now, anybody that spends any kind of time outdoors knows that when the forest goes mute like that, it's rarely a good sign. Normally, it means some kind of big predator is out there, and all the things that are normally chattering away are quiet. I guess it's to avoid being eaten. Not an owl, not a cricket. Nothing was making noise at this point. I remember feeling the hair on the back of my neck rise up. I looked around, trying not to let my imagination run wild, but I didn't see anything. Maybe 2 minutes later, I heard the first growl. It was deep, and it was mean. And again, I felt the hair on the back of my neck rise up. At this point now, I'm standing on the porch. I'm not sitting on that rocking chair. Cigarettes out, beers open, but maybe a sip or two taken from it. I'm more concerned figuring out what's going on out there. One time I had a run-in with a mountain lion. Man, that was a scary one. It's one of those times I thought I was going to have to fight for my life. That memory came back as I was standing out on the porch, but for some reason this situation just felt different. Something felt off in the forest at that moment. I went inside and grabbed my rifle just to give myself peace of mind. I went back outside, determined not to let some wild animal out there get the better of my nerves. But truth be told, I was kind of spooked. I sat back down on the rocking chair, took a swig of my beer, and just listened. Now, the forest is still completely silent, but I only heard that growl one time. So I shrugged it off, thinking that yes, we are out in the middle of nowhere, and yes, there are wild animals out there, so naturally one of them coming up to investigate isn't that big of a deal, as long as it saw me and ran away. Most predators aren't going to come up to a full-grown man with a lit cabin in his background and attack unless they're sick or desperate. So I thought that maybe whatever it was decided that I wasn't worth it and turned around and went on its business. But then I heard the growling again. And let me tell you, looking back on it, that growl is something unearthly. I've never heard anything like what I did that night. After this, I'm pretty sure this thing was stalking me, because after that growling, I heard these grunting noises, almost like an ape that you see at the zoo or watch on TV. These grunts were deep, and they were loud. Whatever it was sounded really big, and I knew that nothing out there that we were going to see could make those kind of noises. So I asked myself, what in the hell else can it be? Next thing I know, the trees out front start to shake, and they were shaking violently like something was grabbing them and just giving them one hell of a shakedown. I stood up again, had my rifle ready, just in case anything wanted to charge me, and I'm squinting into the darkness like an idiot, trying to see anything that's out there that could be causing all of this ruckus. The growling, though, continued to get deeper, and for some reason, I got the distinct impression that whatever was out there making those noises was angry. So I'm still peering out there into the darkness, and by chance, I see this eye shine. But the eye shine is too tall to be anything that I was familiar with. I thought that maybe, just maybe, it was an extremely large bear, and maybe this bear was standing on its hind legs, and it was looking at me like I was looking at it. So I continued to stare at this creature, and it was just standing there by the trees, and I started to slowly make out the silhouette as my eyes got used to the darkness out there. Now, at this point, we're a pretty good distance away. How I saw the eye shine, I think, was just on accident, but I'm peering out there, and this shape that looked almost human was standing out in front of me. But again, I don't know if it was instincts or what, but I got the distinct impression that it wasn't human. For one, it would have to be an incredibly tall man. Two, I don't even think if you tried, you could replicate the sounds that this creature was making unless you had some kind of animal recording on your phone or something. It was just creepy as hell. I'm pretty sure, as I'm watching this creature, I can start to see it move ever so slightly, just breathing in and out. I could see the shoulders kind of moving up and down, like this thing was breathing. But then as I continued to stare, I could see the shoulders moving up and down harder, like this thing was panting. Like maybe it had ran there and it was panting, trying to catch its breath, or maybe it was even excited at the thought of its next meal. But still, because this thing was human-shaped, I had to be sure. I had to make sure before I took the next step that it wasn't a human that I was going to take a shot at. I wanted to know that if I had to defend myself, I was making the right call, and that if it was an animal, it wasn't going to be out there waiting for Wes to get back and attack him either. So I called out to him, and I said, "Hey fella, if you're out there trying to play a prank or trying to spy on us, I wouldn't suggest it. What I would suggest is you move on. We do have rifles here, and we will defend ourselves if we have to." Now, since this story is on a supernatural channel, I know that you already know I didn't get a response. In my heart, I knew that it wasn't a man. I think at that point, I had already started processing the fact that something was going on that shouldn't be going on. But I still called out one more time. I said, "Look, I can see you out there. Move on or there's going to be trouble." Now, because this thing didn't look like it had any intentions of leaving, I wanted to do a little bit more investigating, so I grabbed the flashlight from the coffee table and I went back outside, determined to see this thing for myself. I shouldn't have done that. I should have left well enough alone, because I think shining a light on this monster actually pissed it off and caused what happened next. Maybe I'm just being a fool and it planned on attacking us no matter what, but I definitely think the light agitated it, at the least. When I shined the beam on this creature, I actually yelled out in fright of what I saw. This beast was standing there on two legs, just like a man would, but it was covered from toe to head in this thick, grayish-brown fur. I've played out this memory time and time again. I'm absolutely sure I can give you a very accurate description. So I'll start from the bottom and work my way up. And as I do, I'll answer the questions that you ask about so we can determine what this creature was. The feet were massive. This creature was flat-footed. It stood just like a man would. You said that makes it a werewolf. I say that doesn't make me feel any better. I say you know better than me, and whatever you say I'll accept at face value. But those feet were flat-footed. The legs looked just like a man's legs. It did not look like a dog at all. But the feet had very long nails. Nothing compared to the claws on its hands. It had thick legs, thicker than mine, thicker than anybody I know. The legs and the waist all the way up to the torso were very human-shaped in anatomy, except much larger in proportion, obviously covered in hair and elongated. The hair at the abdomen was thinner, but the hair on the chest was shaggy. It had massively broad shoulders, long arms that were just as muscular as the legs, and the hands looked very human, except the fingers were extremely long, and the nails were wicked. Those nails looked like one swat would do the job of killing you. Moving up to the neck, it was thick at the shoulders, and the hair was shaggy just like on the chest. It had a long muzzle, but it wasn't long and pointy like these dogman encounters that I've heard of. This was long, for sure, but it was also blunt at the end, very thick and rounded. It had a black nose just like any typical dog would, and the eyes illuminated in the flashlight. I don't know what color they were, but it's like when I shine a flashlight on my cat and her eyes light up. That's what these guys do. It gave it that greenish-yellow glow. The ears were on the sides of its head, not up top like you told me a dogman's are. They were short but pointy. And when the beam hit it, I saw exactly what this thing was. I yelled, but I think my reaction caused this creature to react too. Because the next thing I know, this creature charges at me with this primal scream, faster than I ever thought possible. I can't even describe what this scream actually sounded like because I've never heard anything like it before, or since. Unless, of course, I'm having a nightmare about it. Let me tell you this. This thing was sprinting. It was taking these incredibly long strides. Where the trees are, at the end of the driveway, there's the big lawn that separates the trees from the grass. Past those trees is the road, and then after that is another set of trees. At the very end of the grass, before the road and before the trees, are these big rocks that separate the grass from the tree line and the road. When this thing crossed across that and got to those rocks, it leapt over it with the grace of a cheetah and continued sprinting towards me, with its arms moving back and forth just like a man would if they sprinted. Of course, this is all still happening on just two legs. I barely had any time to even react. What I did, I'm thinking any man would do himself. I raised my rifle and I fired. Looking back on it, I should have waited until it got closer. But I know I hit it because of the way it jerked. It screamed again, fell down, got back up, and charged at me again, all within a few seconds. And as it did, it sounded even more ferocious and more pissed off than it did before, if that was even possible. At this point, I knew I had to get out of there, and I ran into the house. I slammed the door shut and locked it as fast as I could, but just as I put the lock on, this thing slammed into the door so hard I fell backwards and fell to the ground. I could feel it shake under my feet. We had antlers mounted on the side of the wall that was right next to the door. When that thing hit that door, it hit it with such force that those antlers slammed to the ground, clattering across the floor. And there I was, sitting on the ground, half in shock, sprawled, sitting out, half sitting, half laying, holding my rifle, but keeping my feet against the door as well. I was hoping that I could at least try to keep this thing out, and the whole time I had my rifle pointed at the door. I was sure that this thing took my rifle shot like no problem, and I knew that even if I got another shot at it, it might not do any damage at all. I guarantee you, I hit that damn thing. But all it did was shrug it off and charge at me again. But still, there I was, lying on the ground like some kind of moron, holding the gun pointed at the door like it was going to do any good at all. This thing just continued pounding on the door a couple more times, and I'm hyperventilating and sweating at this point. It's pounding on it so hard I thought the door was going to splinter. And the whole time it's doing this, it's roaring and screaming. Honestly, I think the only thing my rifle shot did was make it angry. I heard it run back off the porch. I think it was on the grass at this point, just growling and screaming. I was on the verge of tears because I was so terrified. Why didn't it just smash through the window and come after me, or break down the door? I'll never understand, but I'm sure as hell glad it didn't do that. After that, it sounded like it was running back and forth in the yard. It was carrying on like nothing on this planet is capable of. Those roars and those screams. I know I keep talking about them, but I just need to stress the fact that I'm a grown man. I consider myself pretty tough. I like to spend time out in the woods, and sometimes I even go do it alone, but this creature and those noises made me feel like I was a weak child, incapable of protecting myself. All I could think was I was gonna die. All I could think was this was gonna get me, and then it was gonna get Wes. I thought about the fact that I would never see my wife or our children again. I thought about the fact that my dad was gonna have to bury his only son. He'd already buried his wife recently. Now he was gonna have to bury his son too, if there was anything left of me at all. After that thing went off the porch and was running around in the yard, I heard something hitting the house, but it didn't sound like a fist, and I couldn't understand what the hell was going on. I wasn't looking out the window or opening the door to check, that's for damn sure. But later, I found out that it was a bunch of rocks being hurled at the house. On the side of the yard, separating the driveway from the grass, was gravel. You know, those little gray and white rocks. It's really pretty. Not that that's important, but I did pick it when we re-landscaped. But anyway, it made it so this thing had an endless supply of ammunition for it to pick up and throw. But let me ask you this, supernaturalist, and anybody else that's reading or listening. What kind of animal is smart enough to pick up a handful of rocks and throw them at that house? And honestly, I think it was only throwing them because it was in a fit of rage. I know primates might be that smart, but that's about the only thing I know that actually has the hands to do it, and the intelligence. That just solidifies the fact to me that this thing was no actual creature that's supposed to exist on God's beautiful earth. I snapped out of the daze that I was in and got up and made sure the door was locked, even though I knew it was. I put my rifle on my shoulder because I needed to get to my phone. I needed to call Wes and give him a heads up that there was a werewolf outside trying to break into the house and attack me. He would just roll up into the driveway, blissfully ignorant of all the terrors that were going on in that damn forest, and he'd be an easy target for that creature to pick off. Wes had been my best friend since we were 12 years old. I'd die for him. I needed to give him a heads up, even if that meant that I'd get hurt not having my rifle prepared if that thing came in. So I called him to warn him. I needed to tell him that that werewolf was outside. I'm sure if you were watching this, it would be kind of comical, because he picks up his phone and I start rambling about what's going on. I'm pretty sure I was completely incoherent. All I kept saying was, a werewolf, there's a werewolf, there's a werewolf outside. There's a werewolf outside trying to break into the house. Obviously, he thought it was a joke. We liked to kid with each other all the time and play pranks, and he just figured this was my newest one since we were out in the forest. But then I yelled to him to shut the hell up and listen to me, damn it. There's something outside that is trying to break into this house, and I think it's an honest-to-God werewolf. He stayed quiet, probably 10 seconds or so. I was sitting there, waiting for him to respond, knowing that I probably didn't have much time left until that thing broke in. And then he quietly asked, "What the hell are you talking about?" So I screamed into the phone again, "Wesley, there is a werewolf outside. I shot it, but I didn't kill it. I don't even think my bullet hurt it. Now it's pounding on the door trying to break in." Wes said he was already on his way back and that we'd figure it out together. Pretty sure he still didn't believe me though. But then this thing slammed into the side of the cabin like a freight train. It was so loud that Wes heard it on the phone. And then he heard the screaming that this thing started doing again. It was this mixture of a howl and a scream. If I never hear that again in my entire life, it'll still be too soon. But what it did was prove to Wesley that something was actually going on at that house. He heard all the commotion and asked me if I was okay and if something was really happening there. I swore to him on my children's lives that something was out there that was remarkably the same in appearance to a werewolf. I must have explained it to him 20 times, 20 different ways, just hoping and praying that he would actually believe me. He told me he was speeding up to get there. I told him to turn around and leave me there. He told me to piss off. For 20 minutes, this thing ran around the house, screaming, hitting the walls, slamming into it, throwing rocks, doing everything it could to terrify me. Everything short of breaking down the door and killing me right then and there. I was on the phone with Wes the entire time, completely terrified, unsure of what the hell I was going to do, unsure of what the hell he was going to do when he got there. And then finally he said he was coming up. After that it was quiet. He didn't say anything. I didn't say anything. I was just listening to this thing outside, and I'm pretty sure he was lost in thought trying to figure out if I was crazy or if something was really happening. A couple minutes later, I knew he saw it, and I knew that he was a believer too, because he started cussing on the phone, and then I could hear this honking from our truck. He was saying things like, "Holy shit," and "what the hell," and a few other choice words that I don't think you use on your channel, but he was definitely saying everything in our vocabulary. I heard the truck coming up. He yelled into the phone, "Get in the truck. Run out here and get in the truck right now." So I did like he told me to do. Like I said, me and Wes have been friends for a long, long time. We know all of each other's moves. We've been into some seriously sticky situations together, and we've always had each other's backs to get out of it. So I grabbed our weapons. I ran out of the house with my rifle in my hand, his on my back, both our 9s on my hips. I looked like I was going to war, and in some ways I guess I was going to war. War against this creature. I needed to make sure that I didn't die. I was armed, and it was my duty to protect myself and my best friend, because all of his weapons were there with me. So I ran out there, 4 firearms on myself, and I basically dove into the damn truck. He was parked sideways in the gravel. The gravel was kicked up into the driveway, it was kicked into the grass. I saw him fling the passenger door open while he was still in drive, and I just dove into the truck for all I was worth. I'm sure if it was a scene in an action movie, people would either be really impressed that a fat guy like me could do that, or they'd be laughing at the hilarity of seeing some guy jump into a truck that's about 50 pounds overweight with a bunch of guns strapped to him. The whole time I'm running to the car, Wes is honking and flashing his lights, and I think trying to be as loud and as intimidating as possible. When I jumped in the truck, he yelled that that thing took off around the house. He slammed on the gas before the door was even completely shut. So there I am, half on the seat, half on the floor, breathing so hard I thought I was going to pass out. Sweat was literally dripping off of me because I was so scared and my adrenaline was pumping so hard. He drove out of there way too fast, but he wanted to get the hell out of there as bad as I did. But you know what? We survived. He drove down the street asking over and over and over what in the hell that thing was. He just kept asking me, but I was in shock. I couldn't speak. It was a combination of what I saw and how relieved I was to get out of there. And then finally, I struggled my ass up to the seat, plopped down, put the guns down so I could actually sit, and I looked over at him, and I said, "Wesley, that was a werewolf." We went back later to get the stuff, but not for over a week. I mean, we owned the cabin, so there wasn't any hurry. About 2 weeks after it happened, when we finally decided to start talking about it and looking into anything else that could happen out there, we learned that there was a rash of mauled game turning up for a couple of days prior to us going out there. There's nothing in this world that can convince me that that thing wasn't responsible for all those animals out there that were being mauled. It was a long time ago now. We still have the cabin. We do go out there from time to time, but not like we did before we saw that thing. When we do go out there, though, we go out there to make sure that everything's okay. We talk to people around the area, see if anything has happened since then. We make sure that the cabin's in good condition and no windows or doors are broken. But you bet your ass we bring our 12 gauges and the 357s that we have. That rifle might not have done anything, but my 12 gauge pressed up to its chest would blow that thing in half. When we do go out there, it's hard to stay the night. Even after all this time, the sight of that thing out there just reaches a level of terror inside me that I don't think I can ever shake in this lifetime. Anyways, we've never seen it again. When we go out there, we take my oldest son too, and Wes's 2 sons go out there. Of course, when they were old enough, we told them about the story. We didn't see any sense of telling them when they were young and terrifying them. Young kids have an imagination that they have to deal with on their own, so there's no point in their parents telling them that the things that they're afraid of are under their beds are actually real. I always thought that what we saw was a werewolf. After learning the difference and speaking with you, I know there's other things out there. Other things that match the description of a werewolf, but I am confident that what we saw that night was in fact a werewolf. The only thing that disturbs me was looking back at those dates. There wasn't a full moon. Not even close, actually. So, hey, werewolves are real, right? But I guess that whole part about changing only during the full moon is a bunch of crap. And honestly, that's more terrifying than the other way around. This happened to me in 2005 in Redding, California. Me and my best friend were driving down the road. It was about 11 o'clock at night. It was a warm summer night. Our windows were down. We were just laughing and having a good time. As we turned the corner onto this street, we came up on something on the side of the road. I thought it was a big dog at first. It was facing us, but it looked like it was down on its hands and knees, and it was eating on a dead deer. This thing wasn't hunched over like a dog would be, or a wolf, or anything that's normally on four legs. Picture a person down on his hands and knees, pressing his face into the carcass of this deer. That's what that thing looked like. I noticed the size. It looked more like a bear, but the whole situation was just weird. My headlights finally caught it, and it lifted its head. It snarled at us. I saw meat and blood on its face and teeth. This thing looked like a frigging werewolf. It had a big snout. It was covered in fur and had big ears sticking out of the top of its head. And when I say covered in fur, I'm not just talking about its face. Its entire naked body, because it wasn't wearing any clothes, was covered from head to toe in hair. It got up on two legs. You asked me if they were shaped backwards, like a dog, but I gotta look at this thing clearly. The legs were not bent backwards. That's why I don't think this thing was a dog man. I think this thing was an honest-to-God werewolf, because it just had the demeanor and the build of a man. It wasn't incredibly tall. It was only about 6 feet and maybe 300 pounds. It looked just like the werewolves from movies and TV shows. It didn't look like anything that people describe a dogman as. I was in shock at first. I couldn't even move. We were stopped and the lights were just shining on this thing. I could vaguely hear my friend yelling at me to drive. But it was like my head was cloudy. I thought I might hyperventilate and pass out, because this thing I was looking at made me feel like I was inside of a horror movie. Finally, my friend snapped me out of it. Then this thing took a deep breath and roared at us. Then it started running towards us. It ran at us like a man would too, with the arms moving back and forth in a bent motion, like it was running for all it was worth to try to catch up with us. I floored it and took off. I sped past it. It spun around and started chasing after us. Man, this thing was fast. It was hauling ass. It kept up with us until we hit about 50 miles per hour. Then, it just turned around and went back into the woods. I didn't see that part. I was too busy driving for our lives, but my friend was watching out of his side mirror. He saw it go back into the forest. He told me the coast was clear, but I didn't slow down. I sped all the way home. We locked the doors. I grabbed my dad's rifle. We stayed up until my parents got home, and I told them everything we'd seen. My dad asked me if I was doing drugs. I told him I'd never done drugs my entire life, and he should believe me. We didn't talk for a long time after that because I was so mad that he wouldn't believe me. I mean, the amount of fear that I felt that night, he could have clearly saw on my face. My mom, as usual, played the peacekeeper and told us we should just not talk about it to each other anymore. But, supernaturalist, I know what I saw.
Hello, Supernaturalist. This is not my own encounter, but I did talk to the couple that had the experience. I received a call from a man who, along with his girlfriend, had a frightening encounter with a strange creature on November 20th of 2011, outside of Troy in Bradford County, Pennsylvania. I will refer to them as Aaron and Nikki. Aaron told me what they saw scared the crap out of them. I was able to interview Nikki on April 26th of 2012. After conducting extensive interviews with both of them, I learned the following details. At about 11:05 p.m. that evening, they were driving onto Mud Creek Road, traveling past Highway 14 near Troy. As they continued down the dark road, their attention was drawn to the left side of the highway. Aaron, who was the driver, saw some movement and mentioned it to Nikki. They initially thought that a naked man was crawling on the side of the road. Aaron decreased his speed and swerved his truck into the middle of the road and directed the high beams of his headlights towards the subject. He stopped about 30 or 40 feet away and in doing so, realized that this was not a person, but instead a creature that was crawling very low to the ground. As they watched, the creature moved into the squatting position with its back completely straight, somewhat like the stance of a kangaroo. The arms of this creature were held tightly to its body. What looked like long claws that resembled talons of an eagle were easily visible. The claws were estimated to be about 8 to 10 inches in length, and one claw was shorter than the other three. The creature had a muscular body and the head of a beast and appeared to be oversized. It was shaped like a wolf, and at the top of its head there were two pointed ears that looked about 4 to 6 inches long. It had dark, long fur and black skin. Aaron described seeing large canine teeth in its mouth, and the eyes of the creature were about the size of silver dollars and were shiny black. Aaron stated that even though he had his high beams directed at the creature, the light didn't reflect in its eyes. Aaron said he looked over at the body during his 12-second encounter, and for some reason he thought the creature should have had wings, but none were apparent in the squatting position that the creature was in. The creature seemed to be about 5 feet tall. At this point, the creature was in the left lane of the road and about 1 to 2 feet onto the pavement. As they watched in amazement and fear, the creature began to stretch its body. Aaron said that at this point, the animal started to stand on its back legs while also falling over onto its front feet. He said that in this position, the creature seems to be about 6 to 7 feet tall. Then the creature turned his head to the right and looked towards their vehicle. Aaron said that it looked directly at them with an expression that almost looked like panic. He saw it take a deep breath and said he had the feeling that the creature didn't realize that it was being watched, and when it realized it, it was like it was caught doing something that it shouldn't. Once it realized that it was being watched, it leaned back slightly and reached forward with its claws. The creature then took a tremendous leap and cleared a 6-foot embankment and moved out of sight into the wooded area. Aaron estimated that that slope was about 40 feet. As the creature was in the process of leaving, it was perfectly straightened out, its front paws forward and walking on the back 2 legs. The 2 back legs turned out to be very long. Then, just a second after the creature was gone from sight, something else odd happened. A large bird, possibly an owl, suddenly rushed at the passenger side window, almost hitting the glass, and then took off and did not return. It happened so fast, they weren't even sure whether or not it was an owl. Aaron indicated that this creature appeared to be changing in form. He said its shape was nothing like it was when it started and when it was squatted down. Nikki also stated to me that it changed shape into another form, concurring with Aaron's claim. She said it looked like a werewolf with little black hairs. She said when she thinks of that, she always thinks of a man changing into a werewolf. After the experience, Aaron went on the internet to try and figure out what he saw. He told me that the closest thing he could describe the creature to was a gargoyle, but without any wings, and then commented, "I will never forget what we saw."
Most of the people listening here, just like most of the world, remembers 2020 as the year COVID turned the world upside down. COVID had a definite impact on my life, just like it had on yours, but that's not what I remember the most about 2020. You see, 2020 will always be remembered as the year that my friends and I saw a werewolf, aka the year that our eyes were opened to the paranormal. It was the summer of 2020, and my friends and I were driving home to San Diego from Sacramento. We were visiting a friend who had just had a baby, and there wasn't anything else to do that year, so we decided to do a road trip and drive to Sacramento, crash with our friends, visit the baby, and then drive back home. That whole portion of the trip was awesome. The baby was cute. It was good seeing our friends again. We made a lot of good memories, but the memories coming home are nothing nice or fun or happy. I would actually use terms like terrifying or traumatic or nightmarish. And it kind of trumps the whole rest of the trip. All of this happened around 1 a.m. We were about an hour or so out of San Diego, but where I was, I couldn't tell you even if I wanted to. I'm more of a put in your destination and let your phone tell you where you're going kind of guy. All I know, it was one of those roads where there's nothing going for miles and miles. There's just this rocky embankment on one side and nothingness on the other side. When all of a sudden, our beams of our headlight hit this giant gray thing crouching in the middle of the road as we turn around this bend. It was a 4-lane road, 2 going one way, 2 going the other. None of us could make out what it was at first, but as we got closer and closer, we realized that this thing was covered in gray fur. I was driving. My girlfriend Olivia was in the passenger seat. In the back seat was my brother Owen and his wife Nat. Owen was asleep, but Olivia and Nat were awake enough to keep me company as we neared the end of our trip. At first, as we were approaching this thing, Olivia asked if it was a bear because it was so big. As far as I know, there are no bears where we're at, I told her. Then it dawns on me that this big gray furry creature looks like it's crouching down and doing something in the middle of the road, but the peculiar thing about it was the way that it was actually crouching down. It was doing it like a man would. And then I guess that big gray furry creature realized that we were there, or at least decided at that moment that it cared that we were there, and it whipped its head over its shoulder to look at us. It was no bear that was in the road. It looked more like a giant wolf at this point. But again, as far as I know, there's no wolves where we're at either. I just figured as we drive by, it'll spook off this animal. It'll run into the night. But of course, this thing had other plans, and it actually stood up and turned around and watched us approach. And when I say stood up, I mean this thing stood up on 2 legs. Just the back legs. It only stood in the beam of our car for a few seconds, but the 3 of us have talked about this creature in depth numerous times since we saw it. And I think between the 3 of us, we can give a pretty accurate description of what it was that we saw that night. Like I said, the fur was gray. But when we got closer, we could tell that it was shaggy, like a German Shepherd or a Husky's coat. And then there's the fact that whatever this thing was standing up on 2 legs, right? Its head was enormous, especially the top of the head area, like the scalp. It was big and rounded, and the muzzle came into this wide snout, with teeth protruding from either side. The snout area and down its neck and chest were bloody, and you could actually see meat clinging to this thing's face and chest, like it was just ripping into something and having a good old time doing it. It had longer ears, but they didn't look like they were on the top of its head, like you were asking. They looked more like they were on the sides of its head, like a human's would be. It was very muscular, and it was standing flat-footed to answer your question about the shape of its legs and feet. I had no idea that how the legs were shaped would determine what kind of monster we had the misfortune of running into. It had long arms that were pretty buff and big scary hands, and it did not have a tail. As soon as this thing saw our car and saw the headlights illuminating it, it hauled ass out of there. And this thing was incredibly fast. We're screaming at this point, asking what in the hell is going on. Saying, holy shit, oh my god, things like that, you know. We caused enough noise to wake up my brother, who still didn't know what was going on, or see this thing for himself at this point. And I fly by where this thing was crouching in the road, and there's this big, messy roadkill in the middle of the road. I think it was a goat or something. It was kind of hard to tell. That poor creature was shredded. As we drove by, I look over and see this thing is actually sprinting next to our car and keeping pace with us at this point. The way it was running reminded me of a track star, the way they swing their arms back and forth. It was going as fast as I ever thought possible. It looked so human in the way that it moved. It was eerie. It made me think that maybe at some point this thing really was a man. And then this thing cuts across the road right in front of us. I mean, half an inch more and I would have clipped it. As it runs across, it looks at us and snarls, and I could see blood and meat in its mouth. That's how close we were to this thing. Then this werewolf literally dives onto that rocky embankment on the side of us like he's frigging Spider-Man or something, and uses its arms to launch itself further up the rocks. Then it pushes off with its legs to further go up this embankment. And he keeps doing this 2 or 3 more times, like he's galloping up the side of a cliff, until he's up on top, and then darts off into the night. At some point, I had slammed on my brakes to watch this thing, and the 4 of us watched as this monster climbed up the rocks onto the ledge and then dove off into the night. The funny thing is, I have absolutely no recollection of slamming on the brakes. Call it shock or bewilderment or whatever, but that part is just blank from my mind. As it went up this embankment, we got a good look at its back, and that's how I know that it did not have a tail. Its shoulders were wide, but it also looked like it had some kind of hump or something on its back. I don't know if it was extra muscle or just some part of its anatomy, but it was borderline Quasimodo type things right there. Owen was now fully awake, cussing and screaming and being pretty hysterical, even more so than any of us in the car. He was asking what the hell that was, but I didn't have an answer at first. Like I said, I think I was in shock or something. Owen asked again what the hell that was, and in fact that was kind of our collective reaction, until Olivia slowly panted, "That was a werewolf, guys." That response got us moving again. I just wanted to get the hell out of there, so I floored it. I was going almost 100 miles an hour trying to get away from that creature and down the road as fast as I could. We got home over an hour later, but we were still so full of adrenaline that none of us slept that night. The 4 of us just sat around the dinner table at our house talking about it for the longest time. We came to the conclusion that we did in fact see some kind of werewolf, and no matter how much we wanted them not to exist, the truth was there are creatures out there that exist that shouldn't, and we needed to accept that. Olivia was smart enough to get a notebook and take down everybody's description of this creature to make sure that we got every detail that we could remember. For the most part, all of us agreed on the description. Gigantic with gray fur. That fur covered its body. Its thighs and arms could rival any bodybuilder, and a snout that looked very canine, and of course that it was standing on 2 legs. We agreed that it was flat-footed, and that the back of it had a hump and no tail. But of course, the flat-footed part and the no tail, we didn't jot down. We just remembered how it was, and then once we got into contact with you, we discussed what portions of those matched the descriptions that you were asking. Olivia, Nat, and myself noted the blood and the meat that was on this creature's face and chest, and we concluded that this creature was either eating some kind of roadkill, or that it had killed that poor goat, and for whatever reason, it decided it was gonna eat it just right there. Owen was asleep during that part. He had no idea what we were talking about. All he knew is he woke up to our screaming, looked over, and saw a monster running next to our car. We haven't seen that creature since, but we don't really drive down that area often. We have only gone to Sacramento a couple of more times. Once we even flew. None of us can even remember exactly where it happened. Like I said, we come from the cell phone generation that just tells you where to go, so none of us are very good with directions and exact locations. Had I thought about it, or if I even had time to react with something other than terror, I should have dropped a pin in that area so I could say exactly where it happened. But at the time, I just wanted to get the hell out of there and had no intentions of ever driving down that road again. I looked back at the dates like you requested too. and I can confirm there was not a full moon that night. So maybe these creatures don't need the moon to change after all. Nobody else has reported it, as far as I know. And I never thought I would say something like this and be serious, but I can tell you now, wholeheartedly, without a shadow of a doubt, without any type of sarcasm. Monsters are real, dude. Chances are, you've heard my story. Chances are you've doubted it too. There's a good chance you think I'm crazy. If it were only that simple. If only these experiences that most people feel the need to cast ridiculing opinions on were just a fabrication made simply for your entertainment. That isn't the case. At least not mine. I'll start off with a little background. My name is Blake Hill. I'm 30 years old. I've lived a lot of life, too. I have 4 daughters and 1 son. I almost reached fame as a musician and gave it up foolishly. I'm trying to rebuild that. I'm divorced. Sometimes I feel as if these events caused a chain reaction that have ruined my chances to have a normal life. But I refuse to be that cynical. I'm a local truck driver in Houston, delivering lumber to mostly new residential construction sites. I'm a quarter Native American. I won't name my tribe out of respect for my people, though. I'm the oldest of my great-grandfather's 48 great-grandchildren, which means I've learned a lot of our history, a lot of our secrets, and the legends that only my tribe's elders can tell you. Anyway, my first experience was on the 20th of July in 2012. It was a Friday night. I was 19 at the time, and I didn't have many responsibilities other than delivering pizza part-time. So naturally, being a teenager, I was out with friends at a house party in Old Katy, which is a suburb west of Houston, Texas. My friends and I experimented both with marijuana and alcohol, but we were always responsible enough to make sure one of us stayed sober to be the designated driver. That particular night was my turn to be the sober one. My friend Brennan had gotten well past drunk, and once he was starting to behave recklessly, I decided it was time to leave the party and take him home. He didn't want me to take him home, so instead he asked me to drive him to one of his friends' houses that I'm not really familiar with. This friend, who I only remember as Joey, lived on the far east outskirts of Katy. I took a road called Morton Road to get there. We rode with the driver and passenger windows down so Brennan could get some fresh air. The street is one turn off of Morton, called Bartlett. My sense of direction is fairly superior. I delivered pizzas all throughout Katy, and have since become a local truck driver in Houston. Bartlett had 3 or 4 houses on the right side, and on the west side was a fairly large forest area, maybe 40 acres or so, and it dead ends just past the last house. I noticed the moon was full before I even went out that night, and vaguely noted it as I got to Joey's house, which was the second house on the right. I parked my car on the left-hand side of the road, closest to the trees, and I helped Brennan get out of the car. I walked into the porch and Joey came out. He thanked me for dropping him off and we said goodbye. I decided to smoke a cigarette before I left the road. At the time, I shared the car with my dad, and his number 1 rule was not to smoke in the car. After lighting my cigarette, it didn't take long to notice the road was eerily silent. I assume I didn't notice it before as I was helping my noisy drunk friend get inside the house. But maybe 3 drags into my cigarette, I hear these heavy footsteps going across the gravel, maybe 100 feet in front of me. I was alarmed by the sound they made, familiar to the sound of someone pulling something metal against concrete. That's what that sounded like. Now, just so we're clear, my fears have always been werewolves. I've always been into horror movies. I love scaring myself, but the only monster to pop into my dreams have been werewolves. So here I am, alone, standing on a dark road under a full moon, and I hear something big walking too close for comfort right in front of me. I didn't hesitate to throw down my cigarette and get into the car. I told myself, as I was getting in, that I wouldn't turn on my headlights, so I wouldn't have to see what was in front of me. and simply reverse my way back onto Morton Road and then get the hell out of there. Unfortunately for me, my car had automatic lights that turned on as soon as I started the car, a fact that I was aware of but in my panic state just seemed to ignore. Immediately in front of me, about 100 feet as I had guessed, was a 6.5 to 7 foot tall beast on 2 legs. It was covered in black fur, with the body of a gym-addicted man and the head of what I guess could be similar to a German Shepherd or even a black wolf. It had human-like feet that were covered in that dark fur as well, and it had claws sticking out about 2 inches, and it held its left hand out the same way a human would, reaching for something in front of him. I noticed that the fingers ended in large claws, just like the feet did. Well, this was enough to cause my jaw to drop. What got me the most? It was wearing torn blue jeans that seemed too tight and unnaturally torn, and an open flannel blue shirt that was ripped at its bulky shoulders. It looked my way when the lights revealed it and glared at me with narrowed yellow eyes and bared its large fangs. My windows were still down, and I hadn't touched my radio, so I had no trouble hearing that loud growl. It then turned its head to the forest, dropped on all fours, and ran out of sight into the trees. All this took place within about 20 seconds, but it felt like hours. At this point, I literally had tears in my eyes, but I didn't hesitate for 1 second longer to shove my car in reverse and put the gas pedal to the metal. I heard loud growling and grunting as I was leaving. I reversed onto Morton Road and went 80 to 90 miles an hour down the streets leading back to Katy, and I didn't slow down until I was on Interstate 10. While still on Morton Road, I kept my eyes in front of me and sobbed the whole time, because I'd never been so scared in my entire life. I can swear that the look I got from this creature was communicating to me that I had no business seeing him, and he wanted me gone. The look reminded me of criminals on TV being caught for their wrongdoings and wanting to cause harm to those who witnessed it. I got home, I ran inside and called my Scottish Terrier into my room, and I didn't sleep until the sun was up. To this day, I've never had a desire, nor the nerve, to go back to that part of Morton Road. I obsessed over the idea that I had seen a werewolf and researched werewolf sightings on Google, and was intrigued by the Beast of Bray Road and the Michigan Dogman. Their sightings from decades before this. Everything else that came up also fascinated me. But I was disappointed to see that nothing I found on the web was precisely what I saw. While the beasts that others have encountered seem similar, none were spotted wearing clothes. I told my mother and father what I had seen, and while my mother could tell I was being genuine, my father was more interested in me driving that far from home without letting him know, so I stopped talking about it. Of the few people outside of my family I've told, most responded with, "Did you ask the werewolf if he got the vampires yet?" or similarly stupid things like that. It wasn't hard to notice that my story sounded far-fetched, especially considering the fact that I couldn't find any other reported sightings near the Houston area, nor much in Texas either recently. I never submitted my encounter online because I was scared of being ridiculed, or to be honest, scared that if I did say my story that somehow that creature would find out and hunt me down. I'm honestly positive I'll never stop being haunted by the memory of this creature. It's just too vivid and too frightening to put out of my mind. I've also never told Brennan, the friend I dropped off there that night. I didn't tell him what I saw. In fact, I didn't see him again for 2 years until accidentally bumping into him at a gas station. My grandmother even took an interest in my encounter and told me the legend of our tribe's skinwalkers and the cursed enemies, which is very interesting and disturbing all at once. I'm not able to give much detail out of respect for my tribe, but I'll say this. Our skinwalkers are very different than the Navajo tribe's tales. They would transform into either bears or wolves when wars would break out. Once the leader of their enemies were caught, the skinwolf, which is our nickname for these things, would bite and infect them, damning them to become a half-wolf monster on the full moon, similar to most werewolf legends. Our ancestor spirits are most powerful and prominent during the full moon, and it's them who would force our enemies into their transformation. The curse would be passed down for every eldest male of each new generation of the cursed enemy's descendants. These cursed ones vowed revenge on my people, but it started out as an empty threat. Our ancestor spirits who control the curse don't allow them to hurt us. The reason I say it started as an empty threat is because we descendants are no longer pure blood, and neither are most people that we've started families with. I normally would call bullshit on all of this, or say it's just a scary story, but after the night of my sighting and what followed 4 years later, let's just say I have an open mind. Then in the summer of 2016, my mom went shopping at Barnes & Noble and noticed a book by an author who was a cryptozoologist and who I followed on social media in case of hearing anything similar to my experience. She saw it and thought I'd like it. I couldn't put it down, and after reading a chapter where a woman in Tennessee saw a clothed creature just like mine, I decided that after 4 years of hesitating, it was time to write to her. She believed my story, and she told me about a lot of other people reporting things similar to mine. I let her in on my tribe's legends to give both of us an angle we hadn't considered as far as learning what this creature actually is. I never got the chance to discuss the events that unfolded after foolishly going public with all of this to her. And my horror wasn't over. On September 16th of 2016, I was delivering lumber to a new neighborhood in Katy, right near Bartlett Road. The way it's set up is you've got Avenue D and Bartlett Road running parallel to each other, with Franz Road cut off connecting them in between, which is where I was en route to a new developing neighborhood and blew out my tire. My work truck doesn't come with a spare, so I had to call my boss to send over a service truck. That way I could get my tire replaced. All I could do after that was wait. I smoked about 3 cigarettes while writing lyrics when a truck came down the darkening road. I assumed it was the tire guy, but the truck was a 1998 Ford F-150, red, with a single cab. The truck slowed as it came by my truck, and the man in the cab rolled his window down. I didn't pay much attention to him, but I looked up in his direction. His face was hidden, but in a rougher, quiet voice, he asked, "Hey bud, is everything alright? Anything I can help you with?" I said, "I got a service truck due here in about 5 minutes from now to fix my tire. I really appreciate your concern and courtesy though, thank you again." The man turned his head sharply towards me and sniffed the air, then smiled, revealing very yellow teeth, with canines that honestly looked like vampire fangs to me. What freaked me out the most was that this son of a bitch was wearing a blue flannel shirt with patches at the shoulders. The werewolf I saw had a torn blue flannel shirt on. Now, something else that you should know about me is I don't believe in a coincidence. Not after everything that I've seen. My eyes went wide in shock, and this guy's smile grew more sinister as he said, "I remember you." I asked what he was talking about. He said, "I remember you," in this loud growl. It sounded demonic. His eyes, I shit you not, turned yellow. The truck driver came down the road at that moment, and the man looked annoyed, but still very satisfied with himself. He looked at me, his eyes normal again, and his teeth just as yellow, but not sharp. And he said, "I'll see you around, Blake." Right then and there, I almost pissed myself. How did he know my name? "Screw you, you monster," I breathed, barely audible to myself. But this guy was already pulling away. I got his license plate, but I didn't call it in. I mean, what the hell do you say to the cops? "Oh yeah, this dude just drove by and freaked me out. Also, I think he's a werewolf because he had the same shirt on as the werewolf I saw 4 years ago." Honestly, that just wasn't an option. What freaked me out even more was that I looked nothing like I did in 2012. I had a much more professional hairstyle, a tattoo sleeve, and about 100-pound weight loss. It's like this guy knew my scent or something. And then my third encounter happened. This one was the first that I believe was a dogman. It took place 1 week after the night the man and I had our encounter on Friends Road. My ex-wife's grandma had passed away, and that night was her viewing. It took place in Baytown, east of Houston. After the viewing, my ex, my second daughter, and myself went to her grandpa's house for a couple hours. He lives in East Houston, locally referred to as North Shore. My ex and I spent our early childhoods on North Shore, and as we were making the hour-long drive home to Katy, we began reminiscing on our memories of that North Shore. I ended up showing her the house I grew up in, and then passed by my great-grandmother's house, a street over. At that point, I had started to joke to her about going to look for the Channelview Goat Man, which is an urban legend my mom told me about after discussing my encounter a few days before. She was laughing and saying, hell no, as anyone in our situation would, right? Now I'll point out that this area is old and rather run down, so there's no streetlights. I drove a 14-year-old Chevy Silverado with big mud grapplers at the time, so I had fairly decent vision of the road in front of me, but couldn't see the houses or driveways too well. As the road started to curve, I slowed to about 20 miles per hour, and I noticed a big black shadow in the darkness of the driveway that just stood out to me. It was barely noticeable, but I slowed down a little and turned my head towards it. I looked over to my ex, and her eyes were focused on it too, and she said, "What in the hell is that?" And that's when it charged my truck with an ungodly roar that made every hair on my body stand up. This thing shook the entire truck when it roared, and caused my infant daughter to wake up and start crying. It was running impossibly fast, and it was also on 2 legs, just like the werewolf that I saw. It was covered in black fur, with the head of a giant German shepherd, and weird backwards-like dog legs. Its eyes were yellow too, but I swear they were full of evil and rage. Without any hesitation, I stomped on the gas pedal, and the Chevy tore off like a bat out of hell. We were going about 70 miles per hour down this sharp, winding residential street, lights from the surrounding houses coming on as I went. We were silent for about 15 minutes until we passed downtown Houston. "It was just a dog, right?" my ex asked me nervously. She knew of my past encounters, and I noticed her glance at the full moon. "I don't think so," I told her, exhausted. I told my grandmother what happened that same night, and she stared into my face with a horrified expression and told me something else that I never knew. "I never believed my dad," she said. "Never once did I think he was seeing that thing." After some encouragement from me, she finally told me that when he was alive, my great-grandfather would constantly pace on the nights of the full moon. He was a large Native American man with a very stern face and deep voice. He was never known to be afraid of anything, except on the nights of the full moon. He'd hold a piece of metal pipe in his hand, and his yellow Labrador Vernon was by his side, just waiting. When people asked him what he was doing, he would say, "I'm waiting for that wolfman to show his ugly face." My grandmother told him, "Dad, you're not seeing any wolfman. You're just drunk or you're crazy." And he'd reply, "I know what I saw. I know what I know. That thing has been stalking me for years, but the son of a bitch is too much of a chicken to come out and get some of this." He'd say that while raising the pipe. My grandmother never believed our legends until the same encounters with my great-grandfather would start happening to me. I didn't learn much of the legends until after my first encounter, and she feels it can't be a coincidence that the same beings that her father spoke of have now started presenting themselves to me. If I said I wasn't scared, I'd be lying. Gaining more knowledge is one thing, but looking for trouble is stupid in any sense. I'll learn from a distance, if that makes sense. I strongly suggest that you stay indoors on the full moon. Chances are you have no idea what's out there stalking you, and while ignorance is bliss, curiosity killed the cat. After separating with my ex-wife, I decided to speak to an elder in my tribe. He reluctantly told me that the cursed enemies have gotten more powerful and can sometimes become semi-beastly even without the full moon. It led me to the conclusion that the dog man I saw in 2016 was actually the same creature I saw in 2014 in his completely cursed form, and that he positioned himself by stalking me. I don't think it's the same thing my great-grandfather dealt with, though. I truly believe they're a father and son pair. I held on to that license plate number, and I had it ran by a police officer relative. I learned this man's name. I'm not going to list it, but just know that it's an extremely generic name, more common than my own. In August of 2019, I was sent to a small town called Magnolia, still here in Texas. I was to pick up a canceled order and had a helper who I'll just call E for his privacy. The property was gated, surrounded by woods on all sides. I called the superintendent and got the code. There were cameras overlooking the property, which is common, so I didn't think much about it. E and I started picking up the material and loading it onto my truck. We were laughing and joking when the howling started. Now keep in mind, it's daylight at this point, so I wasn't that disturbed until that deep howl began. E looked at me and asked, "Amigo, what is that?" and did the sign of the cross on himself. I replied, "I have no idea," truthfully not wanting to think about the nagging memories that have never really gone away. And then as suddenly as it all began, it all just stopped, and we continued our work in silence. After that, I heard screeching brakes and noticed a black sedan blocking our exit. Still not thinking much about it, I continued to load the truck. "Blake," E said with a nervous look on his face. I looked over to see a middle-aged woman with dark hair wearing jeans and a black t-shirt had gotten out of the passenger side, pointing a Winchester at my head. I immediately raised my hands and said, "Ma'am, there's no need for that. You can have anything you want." She smirked and said, "You've got no business on my property stealing from me, little boy." I told her, "I'm not stealing from you, ma'am. I'm here picking up a canceled order. I'm sure you can see my company's logo on my truck, and I'm more than happy to show you the pickup instructions on my paperwork." I won't bore you with what followed after this. She read my papers, called my job, and argued with my management for a little while before hanging up. She looked at me and said, "I apologize for pointing a gun at you. Seems the superintendent, who we fired, failed to mention that you guys would be picking it up here." "No harm, no foul," I told her. She didn't say anything, but instead answered her vibrating phone. I listened. She said, "Hey, honey. No, they were just picking up the material. No break-in or anything. Hold on." She paused and looked at me. "What's your name, Blondie?" she asked me. "It's Blake," I said. Saying this made her smile in a way that chilled me to my core. Whoever was on the phone, she told my name was Blake, and then continued smiling this disgusting smile. "Okay, love, I'll make sure he knows," is what she said into the phone. Then she hung up the phone and looked at me. E had finished strapping the truck and got into the cab at this point, so it was just the two of us. The lady and I continued to stare each other down. "It seems my husband remembers you," she told me. "You might have heard him and our son making their noises." That was right before I got here. "You see, our boy just turned 18. She was saying this, and her smile was getting wider and wider, like she was noticing the horror on my face and it was making her happy. "He saw you on the camera. Says you guys met twice in Katy, and once in North Shore over the past few years. He wanted to say hi and hopes you're doing well." "Tell him I said hi right back, and let him know that I have nothing to be afraid of. Have a good day, ma'am." With that, I got into my truck. I waited for her to walk back to her car, and then I raced the hell out of there. E and I didn't talk the entire ride back to our office. I could tell he was shaken, but I had no desire to explain myself. 3 times. 3 times this creature remembered me. Coincidence? I don't think so. There's no conclusion to this story. I still don't go out on the full moon because despite knowing that I can't be harmed, the people around me can. My advice remains the same. If it's stupid to do in a horror movie, it's stupid to do in real life. Curiosity kills the cat. I'm the lucky survivor. Don't be the unlucky victim of the never-ending hunger and rage of this beast. I will send any future encounters to the supernaturalist. It's an honor to be part of your journey. In July of 1981, Keith and Diane Williams moved into the home of their dreams, a beautiful log cabin just outside the small community of London, Ohio. Diane was a stay-at-home mom and spent the majority of the days at home alone taking care of their 4-year-old daughter Raven. During the day, Keith was a welder. At night, he went to school for an apprenticeship. The night of the first sighting that Diane experienced was a night just like any other. She was in the kitchen, washing dishes after Raven was asleep and Keith was at school. As she was washing the dishes, she looked up out the window into the backyard and saw movement outside in the shadows. Thinking it was just a dog, she didn't think anything of it and went back to washing the dishes. They also lived out in a wooded area, and wild animals were not uncommon, so it could have been a number of different creatures that roam around the forest. So she went back to doing the dishes until she heard a shuffling noise coming from right outside of the window. When she looked out, she sees a pair of red eyes attached to a large head staring back at her, and knew something was not right. Needless to say, she was still creeped out but trying to brush it off as a wild animal outside, so she went about cleaning the house, until she happened to turn around and see a creature standing on its hind legs looking into the window at eye level with her. After that, she ran around the house, trying to close all the curtains, but as she does, she sees this creature staring at her from another window. By the time Keith got home that night, Diane was in tears and absolutely scared, which sent Keith into protection mode. He needed to protect his wife and child, so he went outside with his flashlight and rifle. He didn't find any evidence, and because of that, he doubted most of Diane's story, thinking it was her overactive imagination, and that she did in fact see some sort of normal animal outside. The doubt that Keith had didn't sit well with Diane, and the two ended up arguing about it for quite some time. She was hurt that he didn't believe her, but he was irritated that she was so easily frightened all of a sudden. About a month later, the same thing happens. She's standing at the window in the kitchen, washing the dishes, and looks up to see this creature actually standing at the window and staring back at her. Terrified, she runs around the house, making sure all the doors and windows are locked and drawing the curtains. But as she does, she can see this creature following her from window to window. She turned off all the lights, trying to hide in the darkness, and called 911. She waited there in fear of her life and the life of her child, hearing a large bang on the side of the house. The police officers arrived and told her to wait inside while they investigated. As they're conducting their investigation, Keith finally arrives home and is told by the police that Diane called 911 and reported someone or something out there watching her, but they found no evidence of anybody out there, and determined that she might have been frightened to be alone. The loud bang was simply a garbage can that had hit the wall in a gust of wind. Again, not being believed upset Diane, and Keith was further confused as to why his wife was so frightened all of a sudden. For 4 months, nothing happened, but at the beginning of December, Keith woke up early and decided to go out and get the family some donuts from a donut shop that had just opened up in the area. He went to his car before the sun had even risen, and as he was shaking off sleep from his eyes, he turned the headlights of his car on. As he looked in the rearview mirror, the rear lights illuminated 2 big glowing eyes, looking in at Keith. It looked like the same creature that Diane had described months earlier. He puts this creature at about 7 feet tall and very canine-like. He slammed on the gas, going backwards out of the garage and kicking up all the snow that had recently fallen. Because of that, he lost sight of this creature.
He quickly got out of his car with his flashlight shining around to see if he could see anything, trying to figure out what the hell it was that he just saw. But again, this creature seemed to have just vanished, and insanely fast. Keith continued to investigate, though, and actually ended up looking on a low-hanging portion of the roof. He was shocked to see footprints up there. Needless to say, this frightened him. Not only had he seen the same kind of creature that his wife had described, but he realized that the creature could still be out there watching him. Not only that, the creature had been on the roof of his home, probably looking in through another window. Keith went inside, waiting until the sun rose, not wanting to be out there in the darkness looking for a creature, or leaving his family unprotected during the night. When the sun finally rose, he called his good friend and hunting buddy, a man named Dennis. When Dennis arrived, he noted the .30-30 rifle slung over Keith's shoulder. Curious, Dennis asked Keith what he intends to do with that rifle, since he couldn't shoot anything around here with it. Keith's only response was, "I just might." After that, Keith showed Dennis the footprints, and Dennis was equally confused as to what type of creature could make prints like that. As they continued to look around, they found more footprints that looked like this thing had jumped from the roof and landed on the ground below, 20 feet in between. Dennis and Keith both described the tracks as 14 inches long, and almost human-like, but not human, and it had a claw mark at the end by the toes. Keith asked the same question that Dennis was thinking. What in the hell could do this? The two of them decided to follow the tracks into the forest. A forest they had wandered and hunted through numerous times in their life. But now, this forest that they were so familiar with felt completely out of place. Keith said at that point, when they were tracking the footprints, he felt like he shouldn't be in that forest. Because this forest was so dense with trees, you could only see 3 or 4 feet in front of you at any given time. This was a concern for the two hunters, because even though they could hear each other moving, they couldn't see each other. So who was to say they were even the ones making all the noise? What if there was a third thing out there moving around the forest? Some of those footsteps could have belonged to the thing that they'd seen outside their home. They would stop at regular intervals to listen, making sure that they weren't being followed. They never heard anything unnatural at this point. They followed the tracks for about 2 miles, adrenaline surging the entire time. The longer they followed the tracks, the faster they went, eager to find out what this thing was. They finally caught a glimpse of this thing, but only a glimpse, just running on 2 legs, but inhumanly fast and too big to be a person. They give chase to this creature, hoping to finally solve the mystery that's been plaguing them, wanting finality to it. At this point, Keith is thinking how some animals are smart enough to know that they're being hunted, and how some of them will even lead you out so far that they can double back and start following you instead, making the hunter become the hunted. As they chase this creature, they come out into a clearing and stop at the site of a tile mill from the early part of the 20th century. It looked like someone had converted a check station into a little cabin too, and these tracks led right up to the back door. Funny thing is, though, the door was shut. Animals don't open and shut doors. It was clear to them that whatever it was that was in the woods with them was at that house. Even though they knew they shouldn't, Keith and Dennis start banging on the door, asking whoever or whatever is in there to come out. Keith knew they shouldn't be doing that, and after a few minutes of debating, he finally convinced Dennis to walk away. After talking with his dad, Keith finds out that an old man lives back there, but nobody knows who he is. Everyone around there had seen him hundreds of times, walking up and down the tracks, but never using the streets, yet nobody seemed to know who he was. About a week later, Dennis brings an old tire to Keith and tells him they're going to take it to the tire shop to get it fixed, because he found out that old man works part-time at the tire shop. Finally, they're going to figure out who this guy is and why some creature with strange footprints went into his home. When they get there, they find out the man's name is George. Keith described George at about 6'5", with very long arms and very fit for a man of his age. But the thing that stunned both of them the most was the fact that George had very distinct, vibrant silver eyes, like nobody's eye color should be. When George looked at Keith, he believes they recognized each other. Keith knew this man was the one that made the prints. The man knew that Keith was the one that had tracked him back to his own home. But that was the only glimpse that Keith and Dennis ever caught of George, because the man seemingly left through the back door. When the owner of the tire store gave them the tire back, the mystery deepened, because on the tire, written in chalk, was a series of symbols that neither of them had ever seen before. Another of Keith's friends jotted down the symbols to research and found out they were some sort of rune, but couldn't pinpoint what they meant. A lot of Nordic tribes used different symbols than each other. Some symbols were shared, but most symbols were regional. They never found out what the symbols meant, but Keith always felt like George was trying to tell them something. He thought about calling the police, but he had nothing to go on. No evidence besides the fact that he and his friend went to George's house with guns. He hesitated, telling his wife, in fear of her wanting to move. He didn't have the means for that at that time, so he suggested that Diane's sister come stay with her and Raven on the nights that he wasn't home. But Diane could tell that Keith was worried, which made her even more worried. Now she worried about the safety of her daughter, her husband, herself, and her husband's sanity, because she knew this mystery was something that he needed to solve. A while later, after all of this had happened, Dennis called Keith and told them they were going for a ride. Where'd they end up? At George's little cabin. Keith feared what Dennis wanted to do, but to his surprise, Dennis told Keith that the police scanner had reported a dead man. That dead man was George. The two of them went towards the cabin, catching sight of a deputy friend of theirs. When they asked what had happened, he told them they needed to see what was inside. The two of them followed the deputy inside, eager to see what was going on. The first thing they noticed was the odor. It was like musty, wet animal hair, like some kind of wild animal had been living there. They looked around the cabin and were disappointed to realize there was nothing in there that could tell them anything about George. Barely any furniture, no food, not even any personal belongings. In fact, the only thing that was in there at all was a little wooden table and a wooden bench. But the deputy wasn't finished. He led them to a different room. A room completely covered in welded steel, attached to each other with metal strips and rivets. Inside that room was a 10-foot metal chain secured to the steel wall. It was obvious to Keith that something was restrained back in that room. But what was it? As they continued to look in the room, they saw there were scratch marks or claw marks all over the place, even on the ceiling and up at the very top of the walls. Some of them were older and dirty, starting to rust. Some were newer, more recent. To them, it looked like whatever was restrained in there was restrained more than once, and for a long time. The three men stared at each other, dumbfounded, thinking of the exact same word but never saying it. After George died, the creature was never seen again. The only thing that was found in the cabin was a jar of silver dollars. According to this testimony, George was buried in London, Ohio, in an unmarked grave. Keith and his family moved not too long after those incidents, but not until early the next summer. Keith talked with a Native American man before he moved. He was trying to get more information, and was told that some things, like this creature, are drawn to places. Someone that had been to their house, maybe not even someone that had been there during their time there, had intrigued this thing, and it wanted to make contact. This native man had seen a pack of these creatures once when he was younger in Wisconsin. He warned Keith not to make them mad. That would cause real problems with these creatures. He warned him that people have disappeared because of them, and described them to look like your typical dogman, or a werewolf. Around the same area, other strange occurrences have happened. Before they moved there, a mayor's wife had her car attacked, and something actually tore the door off of her car. It came out of nowhere, and she said it felt like something was trying to pick up the car. She tried to see what it was. She turned her back to it, but that's when the door was ripped off and she sped out of there. She can only describe this thing as big with dark fur. The police investigated, but found nothing besides the door. There was also no evidence that was found that could prove that the car had been in some kind of wreck. The only damage was to that back door. Another man had hit something in the fog early one morning that he also described as big and hairy. He was only going around 30 miles an hour, but whatever he hit destroyed the front of his truck. The kicker is, though, there was no sign of blood or anything that could indicate that he hit an animal. What kind of creature can be capable of looking through windows, climbing on roofs, jumping 20 feet, ripping doors from their hinges, tracking all the way back to a man's house, and can destroy a truck without ever getting injured?